China launched a new round of military exercises overnight aimed at Taiwan.
The United States is facing two major nuclear powers.
China struck a deal with Brazil to ditch the US dollar and use China's currency for trade.
The United States' most powerful weapon is the US dollar. But now it's in danger. Countries across the globe are ditching the US dollar. The world has been using the US dollar as the global currency reserve for over 75 years. But today, the Chinese yuan has replaced the dollar as the most traded currency in Russia. China and Brazil have signed a deal to trade in Chinese yuan instead of the dollar. Brazil and Argentina are working to create a common currency in order to get rid of the dollar. Russia is moving away from the dollar and replacing it with other currencies. The UAE and India are discussing to trade in Indian rupees instead of the dollar. Even Saudi Arabia is considering to sell oil in Chinese yuan to China. Oil has always been traded in US dollars. It's one of the reasons that made the US dollar the global currency reserve. 70% of all the dollars are outside the United States. If the US dollar stops being the global currency reserve, then all of these currencies will come back to the United States, creating massive inflation, the likes that we have never seen in the history of the country. The economy will crumble, the stock market will fall to pieces. This is the worst thing that could possibly happen to the United States. To understand what is really happening, we have to go back to 1913. Britain was the most powerful country in the world. It had the most capable navy, the strongest economy, and it literally controlled half of the world. So everyone trusted the British pound. However, smaller countries such as Sweden or Italy did not really trust each other because they could just print as much money as they wanted. So instead, they used the currency of the most powerful empire of that time, the British pound. The British pound accounted for 60% of all global currency reserves. But Germany did not like that, so it started World War I to put an end to the British hegemony. But the plan backfired and Germany lost the war. The war devastated the British economy, and the country was already too big to manage. But the British economy did not collapse. So Germany gave it another shot and started World War II. Britain was on the verge of bankruptcy, and the only way it could win the war is by seeking help from the United States. The US agreed to help Britain only if it gave independence to all of its colonies that made Britain rich in the first place. The entire Europe was demolished, the Soviet Union barely fed its people, China was fighting a civil war, but the United States was not even touched, since it was just too far to attack. Thus, the United States emerged as the most powerful country in the world with the largest economy and 70% of all global gold reserves. That is when people began ditching the British pound and started using the dollar as a currency reserve. To rebuild international trade, the United States pegged the dollar to gold at $35 an ounce, and the rest of the currencies were pegged to the dollar. So let's say, for example, France and Spain want to trade with each other, but they don't trust each other currencies. They could just use the dollars and then turn around to the United States and change those dollars to gold. Everyone was happy. Countries began trading with each other. The United States went as far as convincing major oil producers to sell oil only in US dollars in exchange of US technology and protection. The oil was the engine that drove the economy in the 20th century, and the only way to get oil was by having US dollars. The petrodollar dominated the world, which made the dollar the undisputed global currency reserve. But then the dollar almost collapsed.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
The United States printed so much money that it did not have enough gold to convert all of these dollars to gold. That is why the US decided that it will no longer change the dollars for gold. But why did the world still keep using the dollar? Why didn't they start using the gold? Why didn't they ditch their paper dollars? Unlike other countries, the United States could now print as many dollars as it wanted. It printed trillions of dollars to finance the most powerful military in history, to start wars across the globe, to project power, or to lend money to other countries and make them financially dependent on the United States. The dollar became the center and the foundation upon which the global economy was based on. So anyone who did not follow Uncle Sam's rules could now be cut off from the global economy. Oil-rich countries sold oil only in US dollars because this is the only currency they could use to trade with the rest of the world. The golden age of the United States just begun. wasn't gold that made the US dollar so popular, it was the US economy and the military. The United States economy accounted for 40% of the global GDP, so anyone who wanted to trade with the United States had to buy US dollars. The US began producing computers, sophisticated weapons, planes, cars, and everything else, you name it, and the only way other countries could buy these products from the United States is by having US dollars. Especially Europe, who just recently got out of the war and borrowed billions of dollars from the United States to rebuild its infrastructure, schools, bridges, and everything else. And the only way Europe could pay back its debts to the United States is by having US dollars. That gave the United States an enormous power. Other countries could not print as much money as they wanted, because that will create hyperinflation. But the US dollar was kept in banks across the globe as a currency reserve. That meant that the United States could print money and pay for everything it needed. So if China, for example, wants to sell goods to the United States does not have to give anything in return. The US could just print dollars and give it to China. And China knows that it can use these dollars to buy technology from Europe, weapons from China, or oil from Middle East. And most importantly, it could kick anyone out of the global economy if they did not follow US rules. It isolated North Korea when it built close ties with Soviet Union, sanctioned Iran when it decided to build nuclear weapons, squeezed the Iraqi economy when it violated US rules, or destroyed the Venezuelan economy when it built close ties with Russia. If that didn't work, the US could just invade the country across the globe and the world would never sanction the United States, because the global economy is based on the US dollar. But countries such as Russia and China did not like that, so they decided to put an end to the US dollar.
Vladimir Putin breaking his silence tonight, accusing the U.S. and NATO of ignoring Russia's latest security concerns.
China's Foreign Minister Qin Gang has criticized the Americans over the shooting down of a Chinese air balloon last month.
China and Russia are bitter rivals, but as the saying goes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So the two countries decided to put their differences aside and work on creating the new world order.
China and Russia vowed to create a new multipolar world order.
China's GDP had grown from $360 billion in 1990 to over $18 trillion by 2022. China already accounts for almost 19% of the global GDP, while United States accounts for a little over 20%. The gap between the two countries has shrunk dramatically, especially in recent years. And if we account GDP as purchasing power parity, then China has already overtaken the United States as the world's largest economy. Russia no longer sells its oil and gas in US dollars, but rather in rubles and yuans. Iran and Russia are working together to create a cryptocurrency that is backed by gold. Russia is expanding its version of the SWIFT system for global banking. Indonesia is ditching MasterCard and Visa after US sanctioned Russia. The president of France is saying that Europe should not follow blindly the United States against China. The US dollar used to account for 85% of all global currency reserve, but today it accounts for less than 60%. The trend is definitely downward. Russia has convinced the world to move away from the dollar as soon as possible.
President Biden has imposed a variety of sanctions before and after Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
The U.S. and its European allies hit Russia with another round of sanctions amid possible war crimes in Ukraine.
Russia is not North Korea or Iran or Afghanistan. It's one of the most powerful countries in the world and one of the largest economies in the world. The Russian economy did not collapse.
Well, this summer, the Russian ruble hit its strongest level in 7 years. And just a few months ago, Russia posted a massive trade surplus.
Most of the world did not follow the United States and kept trading with Russia. India continues buying Russian oil, while Saudi Arabia and UAE just carried on with business as usual without taking any sides. Turkey built even closer ties to Russia, while Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia just ignored US sanctions. In fact, they started realizing that they had to move away from US influence because the United States would crush their economies overnight if they did not follow US rules. This is how the world economy used to look like in the 1960s. The US was the major trading partner for most of the countries, followed by Great Britain and then Germany. In the next 30 years, the US dominated the world, and the global economy was dominated by the US and its allies. However, This is how the global economy looks like today. China is the largest trading partner for most countries. It isn't just producing low-quality goods, but rather high-tech products. Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers are the largest in the world. China produces 70% of all the solar panels in the world. China has built the largest 5G network in the world. More and more countries are purchasing Chinese technology. That is why China has launched Belt and Road Initiative that will further integrate the world economy to China and make the world even more dependent on China. This dependence on China is pushing countries to use yuan, take loans from Chinese banks, and use China's payment system CIPS, China's alternative to SWIFT. But most importantly, China is building a military that can stand up to the United States. Anyone who has ever challenged the United States authority has found himself at the mercy of the most powerful military in history. But with the second largest economy, China has the resources to build a military that will match the United States. China's military defense budget has grown from $10 billion in 1990 to almost $300 billion by 2021. China has built modern fighter jets, with the largest navy in the world, with 2 aircraft carriers and 5 in construction, and hypersonic missiles. China's economy is expected to surpass the United States economy in the next 10 years. And when that will happen, imposing sanctions on China will hurt the United States more than China. And that is when people will start ditching the US dollar and Chinese yuan will replace the dollar as the global currency reserve. However, not everything is sunshine and rainbows.
China reports its slowest growth rate for nearly 3 decades.
China's slowing economy is causing concern around the world.
China's economy is slowing down. Its population is shrinking.
China's population has declined for the first time in more than 60 years.
China's neighbors are building closer ties with the United States to confront China. China is stuck in the middle income trap. China is experiencing a shortage of high-quality advanced chips after the United States started a trade war with China. On the other hand, Russia's economy is in a serious decline after the United States imposed sanctions. So, will China's yuan really replace the US dollar as the global currency reserve? While China has made a significant progress in the last 30 years, its GDP per capita is still a little over $12,000, which is less than 7 times an average American. Boosting GDP by building basic infrastructure such as roads and bridges is easy, but moving from an industrial economy into a high-tech service economy is the hardest part. Many countries are stuck in the middle income trap, which is why the Chinese economy might not surpass the US economy in the next 30 or 40 years. Secondly, selling oil in Chinese yuan won't really matter because the United States is energy sufficient. But most importantly, oil matters less and less because we are already moving towards clean energy. About 30% of the global electricity supply comes from clean energy, and that number will only grow faster and faster. Thirdly, the Russian economy is a tiny fraction of the US economy, and with Russia no longer having access to European markets and technology, the Russian exports will shrink, while it will become even more dependent on Chinese imports, which means that the ruble will become less valuable, which means that the Russian economy will shrink further. International trade is not based on moral principles and values. People will use the currency that they can trust, whether they like that country or not. It doesn't really matter. China, who is trying to replace the US dollar as the global currency reserve, holds over $3 trillion of US dollars in its reserves. The United States has the best geography in the world, with the most powerful military in history. And despite it being the most advanced economy in the world, it still grows at an average rate of 3%. If China overcomes its problems and escapes the middle income trap, then it will be used as one of the global currency reserves. But it certainly won't replace the US dollar in the foreseeable future.